Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Today, joining me in the studio is Jack Widness and Jim Lengel. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
We're talking about a very interesting subject today, one I'm sure you've read about, maybe in the media. It's called Responsible Wakes for Vermont Lakes. This is a group of people. Actually, we even have an audience tonight, which is unusual. Welcome, audience. And they're concerned about wake boats on Vermont lakes. Gentlemen, maybe you can start introducing yourself and why you got involved with the issue of wake boats in Vermont.
Sure. I'm Jim Lengel. We moved to Vermont here in about 1972. Been here on and off all that time. We're now retired. We have a place in Duxbury and a place on Lake Elmore.
Nice.
And we don't want wake boats on Lake Elmore. So that's why I got interested in this.
Okay, Jack, go ahead. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having us, Pat.
Oh, you're welcome.
This is really wonderful. So I live on Lake Raponda. I've been coming to Vermont my whole life. So as you can see, that's quite a few years. Both my parents were born in Vermont, and I've spent time on the lake. And like Jim, 4 or 5 years ago, I saw my first wake boat.
Right.
And I figured out what they're all about, and that's why I'm here.
And so maybe we can tell a little bit about the organization that you formed and also about wake boats themselves, because we're going to show a little video so our viewers understand as well.
So thanks. So yeah, so we began, it's almost exactly 2 years ago we began. This was a group of a couple people in Vermont that that noticed what Jim and I had is the wake boats, have the potential for causing problems. They got together. Somehow they found me, invited me to join them. This is a small group, and they wanted to know what to do. They've been talking to Oliver Pearson, who's the manager of lakes and ponds for the DEC. And Oliver said, "Why don't you get together and you can do this through the petition process?" And next couple of weeks, we invited a few others, and we grew like topsy, and we're off to the races. The thing I would just want to mention, Pat, is that our view of this is we're a citizens group. We're not a nonprofit. We just came together. We've seen something that we think fits with Vermont, what's been going on historically from a conservation standpoint. Back many years when you think about billboards. And you think about Act 250, those were grassroots groups, or more recently and more relevantly in the 1990s when they had the jet ski issues on lakes. Now they're confined to 300-acre lakes and above. But, we see ourselves as part of that, and we want to have a place, with these other Vermonters who've done so much.
Well, and I think it's important for our listeners to know that you don't want to eliminate wake boats.
We don't, not at all.
You just want, as your group's title says, responsible wakes. I don't know who came up with that, but that's a great title. But I think that people need to understand you just want them to be dealt with responsibly.
That's correct.
And so could you, for folks listening, could you tell us the difference between a wake boat and a water ski boat? Because we all know what water skis are.
They're very different, and believe me, I knew what a water ski boat was, but water ski boats skim along the surface. They like calm water, and they travel at about 30 miles an hour. They go very quickly. The wake boats are very different. It's a very heavy boat. It's a very powerful boat, and these try to create a wake. So for that to happen, you have to weigh down the back of the boat. And you can do that with your boat motor. A configuration of the engine is different, and you have these large ballast. And the objective is to go slowly, not to skim across the water, but to plow through the water so that you create a wake, a wave that's between 2 and 4 feet high. That is a big wake. And that's what caught my attention the very first time I saw these.
Right, and then people, we can talk about the sports, but they use their skis without holding on in some cases, and they just use the wake for skiing without anything.
Hanging 10 on Vermont Lakes. That's right.
That's great. We're going to show you a video right now, actually, that Jack did on your lake, and it's got sound, so we'll be back after the video, and we'll continue our discussion.
Here are two examples of wake boats. They create huge waves by loading ballast tanks, sit low in the water, and some use jet propulsion. These waves were generated 800 feet from shore and send the raft bouncing 1.5 feet above waterline. Here the waves are bouncing a dock 1 foot above waterline. These waves, once they reach shore, are capable of knocking over a toddler or senior citizen.
Okay, so Jim, what threats do wake boats and wake sport, that's hard to say, wake sport pros, what's the issue here with the wake boats?
Well, as we just saw in the video, these are quite powerful machines that we've never seen before on our Vermont lakes. And what we've seen is that those waves erode the shores, first of all, and they do damage to property. We also saw that they stir up the bottom. Jack explained how they put the rear of the boat, the stern, way down, and the propellers mess up the bottom, raising phosphorus, which has been in the sediment for years and years. That phosphorus feeds certain kinds of algae, and those algae can produce things that are poisonous, like cyanobacteria and other things. They also have ballast tanks. That's how they get the rear end of the boat down, is by filling the tank with water. Now, if they go in one lake that has some of our invasive species, like Eurasian milfoil or zebra mussels, they pick up those from one lake, they trailer their wake boat to another lake, they launch it. When they empty out that ballast, those invasive species are going to get into the second lake. They also, as you saw in that video, they can swamp small boats, kayaks, canoes, sailboats, paddleboards. Those wakes are pretty powerful, and they'll spoil it. They'll even spoil water skiing. You can't water ski if there's a 4-foot wake traveling down the lake in front of you. And you saw in the video also that they damage docks and other shoreline structures. They make it hard for the rest of us to use our lakes for the things we've always done on our lakes.
And I have a feeling they're not quiet.
Well, they have 400 to 600 horsepower engines.
Right.
And you can imagine, some of them, the latest models are advertised with 1,200 watt stereo systems. So this is something. It's a form of boating that we're just not used to in Vermont lakes, and we're not sure they're a good idea.
Yeah. Is this gotten to be a big sport in Vermont? Do we know how many are out there? Has anybody looked into that?
Well, we don't know how many boats are in Vermont. As I mentioned earlier, I noticed them 4 or 5 years ago on my lake. So maybe they've been around in Vermont for 10 years. They've been in other parts of the country. But to answer your question more directly, it's a fairly small percentage. And we tried to take a survey of a number of lakes, and it's about one wake boat per 100 or less, or more, I should say, other
so it's
vessels
probably
on the water.
Easier to put in controls as you're recommending now, rather than
exactly. I mean, that's part of our thinking.
Right. So, what are you looking at to manage the wake boats in Vermont? What are you recommending?
Well, our group put together a petition a year ago. We spent a year putting it together, deciding what to do, having many discussions. And the idea is to get them in deep water, far from shore.
Right.
Because, we don't want to, totally eliminate them, but we would like to have them in a place where all of the things that Jim mentioned are less of a problem.
Right. You mentioned a petition process, and shame on me, but I don't, what is it? That's through A&R. What does that process do, and how do you get a hearing on this issue?
Okay, so again, and when we talked to Oliver Pearson,
Right.
his suggestion was rather than go the legislative way, which was another possibility to change this, you can change it through the public use of water rules, which 20 years ago, may know better than I, the legislature gave the authority
Right,
to the agency to make these decisions, and so we're going through that process right now.
So you go before the rule committee once you get heard at A&R? Is that sort of there must be some kind of a hearing somewhere where
Yeah,
you'd
Jim,
have
you
to...
want to just
Sure.
explain the procedure there?
Sure. The Agency of Natural Resources proposes the rule,
Right.
Secretary, and sends it to the Secretary of State, who sends it to the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules, ICAR, which is really the lawyers from various agencies who are interested in this rule. They make sure that it's consistent with the rest of Vermont law, consistent with administration policy, and that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Once they've found that it's okay, it goes to a public hearing. They also usually tell the agency, you need to conduct a public hearing on this. If it's something that's public, the agency will then conduct a public hearing. They may modify the rule as a result of what they hear, and the final step is the LCAR, Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. They make sure it's consistent with existing Vermont law, with the authority granted to the agency.
That's great.
That's the last step of the process.
This is a few months away, eh? This is
is.
going to take a little while.
We thought we were going to be done with this long ago.
Exactly. No problem. Welcome to politics and
Yeah.
legislation. What I found interesting is you think that, and I understand why you say this, that the wake boats are in conflict with 4 Vermont-related statutes. And can you explain why you're saying that and what statutes you think they're not in compliance with?
Okay, the first one is the one that I alluded to earlier, the public water use statute.
Right?
And there, the Agency of Natural Resources is responsible for maintaining the lakes in their current condition or improving that. For the present, and I would emphasize also for future generations. And so, from what you've heard from Jim, I hope it's clear that there's a problem there. And so what we're trying to do in our petition is to get them to think about this. Wake boats have not been around for a long period of time. They're not considered what we would call normal or traditional watercraft. And so therefore, this is one of the areas that we've brought up, and that's the point of our petition, where there's a problem. So that's one. The second one has to do with aquatic invasive species. Now, Jim alluded to this, but in Vermont, one of the statutes is you can't take aquatic invasive species from one lake to the next.
Right.
So that involves the Department of Transportation. Now, that's a different statute. So when we were putting our statute together, the advice we got is, just deal with one statute. But in fact, dealing with our statute, because of wake boats and how they work, that is with their ballast tanks, which cannot be emptied. So they have between 8 and 15 gallons, or 25 gallons, I should say, when they leave the lake. And so that is what can contaminate the next one. So they're moving from lake to lake.
Right.
They're not following, Vermont statute.
And can I just say, can I stop for a minute? If it can't be emptied and you would want it to be inspected, how does it get, that's a problem.
That's a big problem.
Yeah.
That's a
I
big
didn't
problem.
understand that when we were talking about that before, because you've got to be able to empty it out and clean it out in order to
and
protect the
inspect
other
it,
lakes.
and you can't do any of that. So those are at least 2 of the 4.
Great. Goodness. You all, as your committee got together, you put together a summary of looking at what would happen if there were no regulations and what would happen if we were able to put your regulations in place. And I thought the comparison, we've actually touched on some of them already, But maybe, Jim, you could talk about what the difference is between no regulation and regulation.
Sure. I think we did two scenarios. We
Right.
did what's called an economic impact analysis. What would this rule do to Vermont's economy if we passed it? And the questions we asked were, what would happen if the rule didn't get passed, if things were just as they are now? That's scenario one.
Right.
Scenario two would be, if the rule is passed, what would it look like? And under scenario one, in our study, we found that wake boats would grow. The number of wake boats would increase on Vermont lakes. We'd go from having a few dozen wake boats to having a few hundred wake boats. Those wake boats would have quite an effect on the nature of our lakes. They would drive off the other forms of recreation, and they do environmental damage. And that would cost us money.
Right.
People would stop visiting Vermont lakes if they were like a washing machine full of wakes,
Right.
if they were eroded, if they were polluted, if they were full of cyanobacteria. It would ruin our tourist economy. The Department of Tourism will tell you that 16% of the people that come to Vermont come for water things.
Right.
They come to fish, they come to paddle, they come to sail.
Yeah, we come to paddle in the fall to enjoy the colors of our leaves and all the leaves surrounding the lakes. That's sort of one of the
That's right.
pleasures of our streams and lakes here.
That's right, and it's important
Yeah,
to our
right.
economy. If we did pass the rule, then there would be fewer wake boats because they'd be restricted in operation to fewer lakes. And it might have an effect on the boat dealer industry. They'd sell a few fewer boats.
Right.
But it would have the opposite effect. It would let our water-based tourism continue to grow. Currently, it's growing at about 15% a year, and we think with this rule it could continue to grow.
That's great. You know what? You were talking about the invasive species, and we've dealt with zebra mussels and Eurasian milfoil for forever. When I was in motor vehicles, I remember we always had cautions for zebra mussels and on the back of the boat registrations. But you mentioned spiny water fleas. May I just ask what the heck that is? Because that one's new to me, and I don't know that I even want to know about it.
You want to take that one, Jack?
Sure.
That's a dandy.
So this is a little creature, a little animal.
Great.
But like all of these invasives, Pat, they had to come from somewhere. And so the reason you haven't heard about it, perhaps, is because it hasn't come here quite yet in large numbers. For instance, they're in Lake Champlain, but they're not in a number of other lakes. But this is a small animal that competes and outcompetes what goes on at the bottom of lakes. So all of that's been there for millions and eons of years, naturally, it disturbs that because it outcompetes that. It's the same thing with these other Eurasian milfoil. It outcompetes the normal water weeds and other things that we have. They have a canopy that the light can't get down. So these normal processes that have been dependent on one another are affected.
Wow.
And this is one that I would say may be coming. We'd like to avoid it, but guess what? If we allow these wake boats and the potential for their bringing these in, that's part of why we are so
Right,
concerned about
right.
this.
But it is in Lake Champlain, but not.
Yeah.
We've managed to keep them there. Sort of.
We hope so, but
Yeah.
if Lake Champlain boats go
Right.
to Peachum Pond,
I
Lake
understand.
Iroquois,
Yeah.
Yes.
the potential's there.
So with your permission, we're going to show a graph that depicts a maximum wave power comparison for you between ski boat wakes and wake surf boats. And Jim, are you going to talk us through this? It'll be displayed on the screen, and you can tell folks what they're looking at.
That's right. This graph came from a study at the University of Minnesota done in 2019. This study looked at wake boats and normal boats and ran them down a lake in Minnesota with some equipment 200 feet away, 300 feet away, 400, 500, up to 600 feet. And they measured the power of the waves at each level, just to see what really happens. It was done by the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, a bunch of engineers, hydraulical engineers and people like that. They ran the study dozens of times, and as you'll see on the graph, the red and the blue dots represent the wake boats. That's the curve that starts at the top and runs down. And you could see that at the beginning at 100 feet, the wake boats have 5 times the amount of wave power as a normal boat, the normal boats being the yellow and the green down at the bottom of the graph. As you move out, you see that the lines get closer together. The wake boats' wakes dissipate, and they approach the equal power of the normal boats. But even at 600 feet, which is the farthest they went, they were still almost twice the power of the normal boat. So finally the conclusion was more than 600 feet is needed in order to dissipate these down to what they call the reference
And
condition.
you've included that in your recommendation, correct, the 600 feet?
Well, we included 1,000.
Oh, 1,000.
Because subsequent studies done at the University of Quebec in Montreal, one was done on Lake Memphremagog, the other was done on a lake in Quebec. They ran the same kind of experiment with a wake boat and a normal boat with a different kind of measurement device. And they found very similar results. At the result, their recommendation was to the local authorities in Quebec, these boats got to stay 300 meters from shore. That's 986 feet. So as more and more research comes in, we're finding that the power of these waves goes a long way.
Wow, great. Thank you for that. Jack, maybe you can, since we talked about the 1,000 feet, maybe you can talk about the other proposed rules that you've submitted in your petition for the agency to consider.
Okay, well, there's 2 other parts of the rule that we have proposed, and then there's a very important one that the DEC has added. Maybe we could talk about that later. But the other 2 are 20 feet depth is the minimum depth that they should be operating. And it's for some of the reasons we've talked about earlier. The boats are tipped up, the propeller is downward, it's stirring up. So the science is that at least 20 feet down, you have disturbances significant of phosphorus and other things that are present on the bottom of lakes to cause a disturbance. So we proposed 20 feet, and the DEC agreed with us that is reasonable.
Interesting.
The other thing that you need is you need a place for wake boats to operate. So you're so far from shore, and you cannot be in that area, we think, in order to avoid these adverse events. And you have to be in deeper water. So you need another space. So what is that other space? And the other space that we recommended for a wake sport zone is what we call it, where they could enjoy their sport, is at least 60 acres in addition to those other things as a leftover space on the lake. So those were our 3 things. And then, as I said, the DEC has added another very important one.
And is that the home lake rule that you were talking about? Why
Exactly.
don't you talk about that? Is that
Well, the home lake rule is very, very important. And we wished we could have included it originally, because what we did in our petition, and we spent 5 or 6 pages talking about this, is that because of the ballast tanks and what they can do, and they cannot be inspected, our concern, there was nothing in the public use of water rules about AIS spread. This is a whole nother statute. And so bringing this in was not possible for us. But after discussion around the state with these public meetings, and we were concerned that this would be pushing boats onto other lakes, the wake boats, that is. And so we foresaw that this was going to be a serious problem, but we didn't have a way to solve it. But the DEC, in discussion with these people on the Northeast Kingdom lakes, and we're very thankful for that, came up with a home lake rule, which means you can't have your wake boat going from lake to lake. And this includes coming from other states, unless it's been another season, and then the AIS would have died over that period of time, or unless it's been examined and cleaned in an authorized type of facility.
Okay, so they would have the winter months and the months between boating season to get this all taken care of. That
Right.
makes sense to me.
And they're planning to have some sort of a sticker program that they're working the details out on. But
Oh, great.
this is so important. I
Yeah.
just can't tell you how important this is.
Well, especially since I didn't know you couldn't get the water out of the ballast. That's just, they'll just thrive in there. Wonderful. So you also included, which I found very interesting, some new definitions. And I don't know what their reaction is to this. Maybe we could go through some of them. The first was the wake boat itself, and I don't know what change in the definitions you proposed.
Well, there's not a change in a
Which is-
definition. You have to have a definition to begin with.
Oh, they never had one? No. Oh, well, there you go.
Well, you know, once you put something into law, there's things called loopholes.
Yeah, exactly.
You've heard about those
Yes,
before.
I have.
So, I mean, this is one for the technical people and the lawyers to figure out. But essentially, you know, we're saying that the wake boat is a vessel on the water, a motorized that has ballasts, and it has other devices in their design or that are part of the boat that cause enhanced wakes.
Right.
So it's a question of how you put that together in legalese, and the
Okay,
DEC,
they'll do
we
that.
made suggestions, but they'll come up with
That's
their own
great.
definition.
And so the other one was wake surfing, which is a sport. And
Yeah, so
Jim,
wake
can you do that
surfing.
one, or Jack?
Yeah, wake surfing is what you do behind the boat. We were talking about this earlier. So surfing, so you don't need to have a rope. And in fact, this activity takes place instead of the water skier, who's, you know,
Right.
50, 60 feet behind the boat, maybe 30 feet. You know, we're talking about 10 or 12 feet, because that's where the large part of the wake is. So they may go up onto the surf with a rope. They drop the rope, and then they're surfing from there on.
Is there a problem with these boats from a balance perspective? I mean, if you've got the motor and the ballast all in the back, so they tip up, are they safe?
Well, if they're tipped up, you know, there is a little bit of difficulty seeing over the top.
There
And
you go.
so, you know, the concern about personal injury, and I spoke with a woman who was swimming on Lake Champlain, and she almost got run over, you know, by one of these boats. So it's not unheard of to have, you know, serious injury.
Lovely.
It happens. Not very often, but
Right.
it's a concern.
And so the other two things was wakeboarding and then wake sport zone. But maybe you could explain those two as.
So the wakeboarding is you still have a rope,
Right.
but unlike wake surfing, they go about 10 miles an hour. And for references, water skiing is about 30 miles an hour. So this is in the middle. So this is 20 miles an hour. So they generate big waves. You're on a rope. You're going back and forth. They don't have to go in a straight line, as is the case with wake surfing. They can move a little bit. They go a little bit faster, but
Right.
they still generate some pretty good sized waves.
Interesting. That's great. And wake sport zone, what is that?
Well, that's what I mentioned
Where
earlier.
you like to have them confined a little bit into the,
That's the extra space
Okay.
after 1,000 feet
right,
and in areas where they're not,
okay.
there's at least
Yeah.
20 feet of
One
depth.
thing we haven't mentioned, we haven't talked about, and we didn't talk about it when we were talking about this before, is fishing. Usually when you fish, you like things to remain calm and quiet. Where are the little fish doing while these guys are running around the... It's probably difficult, isn't it, to fish?
It's certainly, we've got lots of testimony from anglers.
I would think
and
so.
some very interesting videos of some fisher people in a bass boat, which is a flat-bottomed boat,
Right.
and
And
they're
we're big
sitting
on
there.
bass here.
They're sitting there. I see them at Lake Elmore over in the dark edge,
Right.
where the mountain comes
Right.
down, quiet, and they're trying to
Exactly.
get that bass that's over
Yeah.
there, that giant pike perch or whatever they're looking for. And the last thing they want is a lot of noise and a wake to come.
Yeah.
And often they're overlooking at the shore. The wake comes from the center of the lake. And first of all, it tips the boat. And second of all, it spooks the fish.
Right.
So most fishermen find wake surfing, that kind of activity,
I can see
not
that.
consistent with what
I'm
they're
one
trying
of those
to
people
do.
in the canoe looking at the lovely leaves fishing. That's what I do. So There you go. Anyway, I want to show you another graph, and I don't know, Jack is going to explain this. It's one that depicts lake bottom damage, and maybe
Okay.
I love this graph, by the way. It's very explainable.
Okay, so this graphic shows a normal sort of motorboat. To be a wake boat, you just have to imagine it's tipped up. But if you look at the figure in terms of what's going on at the bottom of the lake, things are being disturbed. And there's a lot of life at the bottom of the lake. I mentioned these earlier when we talked about the spiny water fleas, zooplankton and little organisms. And so these are things that bugs eat, and fish eat bugs, and loons eat fish. So they're all part of, you know, the biosystem that's being disturbed. The other thing that you see in this figure is that the plant material that's in a lake. So if you have, let's say, Eurasian water milfoil in the lake, if they go in these areas, they can grind this up. The propeller is a little bit further down, and then once it's cut up, it can spread throughout the whole lake.
Right.
You do not need seeds for this to spread. You know, a little part of a leaf, and they get spread around, and so that becomes a problem. The other things that Jim was talking about is phosphorus gets lifted up with the sediment. And as you know, phosphorus can contribute to algae blooms. And there have been some very recent interesting science on this, where after just a couple passes of wake boats, that the phosphorus concentration in that area, these are where the depth was maybe 20 feet when they were going over, the phosphorus concentrations raise. So this is, you know, very good evidence to suggest that this is at least a contributor to some of these blooms. It's not the only thing, but it's certainly not helping them.
Wow. The other night, what was it, the 15th, I think, there was a public hearing. That's right. I watched some of it, excuse me. There were a lot of people there and also watching on Teams. I think you said they used, excuse me. Can we talk about that a little bit? You had the gentleman from Oliver Pearson from DEC talked, and he gave a good presentation. And what did you hear from your folks and from the folks that are probably not happy with what you're trying to do?
Well, the Department of Environmental Conservation has done yeoman's work in making sure they've talked to many, many different Vermonters as they craft this rule. They've been at it about a year. They've had two public hearings last summer. They had another one on the 15th. They're going out of their way to seek input from everybody. On the 15th, they presented their draft rule. Oliver Pearson is the manager of the Lakes and Ponds Division of DEC. And 100 people showed up in person up in Greensboro at Caspian Lake, near Caspian Lake. 170 people were online at one time or another. About 58 people spoke. And of those, most of them, about 91%, spoke in favor of a rule.
Great.
And of that 91%, most of them wanted even stronger than what the DEC
where are we
is
talking about? The
working on.
gentleman from, is it Michigan? No, where was he from?
Well, he's from Wisconsin.
Wisconsin. Yeah, that was amazing to me.
Right.
Maybe you could talk about him a little bit.
So this was a total surprise. This was a gentleman from Wisconsin who has also a camp on Averill Pond, and apparently, you know, goes back and forth. He keeps his wake boat out in Wisconsin. The lakes there are much larger, as he explained to us. They may be 8,000 acres or bigger, and our lakes in Vermont are much smaller. So the point that he was making was that he never uses his wake boat because the lakes in Vermont are too small, too susceptible to these sorts of environmental and other problems, and so all his wake boat is done out there. And you know, from his perspective, we shouldn't be doing this on any lakes in Vermont, at least inland lakes. You know, we're not talking about Lake Champlain, but the smaller inland lakes, which is what our petition is focused on.
He was sort of the center of many of the media articles. I saw this guy and I thought, well, good for you. Well, that was great of him to step forward like that. I was very pleased to see so many people on Zoom and also in person, because one of the things I've always had a problem with here is how they advertise public hearings. And unless you're looking for it, you don't know it's there.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden they pass this rule and you're like, whoa, where have I been?
Right.
And I'm glad to see maybe your organization and others were really getting the word out, because that's important.
Pat, that's been a struggle with us all along.
Yeah.
People don't know what wake boats are.
Right.
I didn't know what a wake boat was 5 or 6 years ago. So, I mean, this is a huge problem, and we've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort. We're a relatively small group, and it's hard to get the word out, and that's why we're very appreciative of you for doing this today.
When I was told about this, same thing. What is a wake boat? And so I'm glad to be able to help get that out. But it's a problem with rules in Vermont, and I don't know how you make it better. They put it in the newspaper, but you've got to know it's there. And so I'm hoping that maybe we'll get some word out for people to be interested in this. Because if you've got land on a lake or go to a lake, especially if you're a fisherman, hello.
But Pat, those are the people that know their lakes.
Yeah, exactly. They'll
And
know what's up.
that's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
And that's where all these scientific studies come from. They have to come up from somewhere.
Right.
So it's people's experience. It's this real experience that you have on your lake that results in the
Maybe
science that's
tourists
being
will be a
done.
little surprised, right? When they come to Vermont and go, what is that? And Oliver seems to be listening for sure. I mean, I think DEC sounds like they're really paying attention. And with 90% people saying do something, and I think what's good about what you're doing, if I may, you're not saying stop, no boats. You're being reasonable about it. And I think those who have boats can't be quite so angry about it, because you're being reasonable. So it's those that say no that sort of start the ball rolling.
So one thing I would just add to that, Pat, is that if someone on a lake owns a wake boat, and if this becomes enacted where they can't use their wake boat, they can use their wake boat, but just not in wake boat mode. So what I mean by
what
that
is
is
that?
they can't fill up their ballast, or
Yeah.
they can't use devices on the boat that make enhanced wakes, but they can continue to use their wake boat as a non-functioning wake boat.
They
I
can
see.
go.
Okay.
They can go fishing.
Yeah.
They can go cruising. They can swim off the boat. They can pull a water skier. The thing that is not allowed is wake sports that create gigantic wakes.
Right.
They could go within 200 yards, 200 feet of shore. And some people, I don't know if you've seen these boats, they're very luxurious. Some people use them for cruising and not for wakeboarding.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, they look beautiful on the videos that
They
that we
are.
have, but I have to go check that out. So what are you thinking are additional obstacles that you're going to have to work on to overcome to hopefully get something passed that will help you out? What's ahead of you?
Our first task is to convince the Department of Environmental Conservation to strengthen their rule.
Right.
Our petition asked for the wake boats to stay 1,000 feet away from shore.
Right.
Their drafted rule says 500 feet. Well, that's not enough.
Right.
The science shows that. Our experience on Lake Raponda and Lake Fairleigh and other places where we've seen wake boats show that it's got to be much more than 500 feet.
Yeah.
That's our first task, convince them to propose a stronger rule. Next task is we have to keep our supporters informed and excited,
Right.
because rules like this don't go through without opposition.
Right.
And so our third task is prepare for that final step, that public hearing, where we expect the opposition to show up in force and try to fight the rule.
Did you get a sense from the other night that there is a large opposition? It doesn't sound that there's many anyway, many boats.
There were 5 that didn't want any rules or regulations out of 58. So we're talking about 9%.
Yep.
And 2 of those were boat dealers.
Ah, interesting.
So
Well,
that's where most of the opposition comes
right.
from.
Oh, that would be interesting to see, have them talk.
But Pat, this is another reason why I and the others got involved. We know the people on our lakes. We know the reality. These testimonials, you know, we understand this. That video that we showed earlier that I took, you know, these boats were out 800 feet from shore. When those waves roll in that you
Right.
saw in your video, I can tell you, those waves are bigger than any wind storm I've ever seen on my lake.
Right.
And, you know, I'm there year round.
Yeah. And we're always worried about our shorelines here. There's a big discussion in the legislature all the time
Absolutely.
about
That's right.
about the shorelines.
That's right. We spent a lot of time with the Shoreline Protection Act a few years ago
Right.
to try to
Right.
preserve
I
the
remember that.
shorelines, prevent erosion, and keep our lakes the natural way they are.
Yeah.
And this just flies in the face of all
Right,
that work.
Right. And you did say that the DEC seemed to get the 20-foot depth. That
We
was
agree.
they were okay with
We
that.
agree.
Yeah. And I know this is probably, I should know this if I'm a boater, but I don't. How does a boat know where's that 20 foot? How do they know that?
Well, Pat, these boats don't come cheap.
Oh, they have these little
So-
things that tell you?
So they have depth assessors on the boat.
Oh, okay.
These cost, you know, a new one costs $150,000 to $170,000. This is
Well,
not.
no wonder the dealers are a little upset.
And so
wow.
they have depth finders
Yeah, right,
on them, and
exactly.
they have GPS. And so
Oh.
these are not ordinary Vermonters' boats. These are the boats for a
lakes
few.
in Vermont that don't seem to quite fit there with my little canoe. But there you go. So, well, I'm glad that the DEC is kind of meeting you a little bit halfway anyway.
They've come a long way.
Yeah,
They've been very supportive.
Yeah.
We're very enthused with their recognition of the problem.
So let me talk a little bit, as we were talking before about the data that you've been looking at and the research you've done. Can you talk a little bit about? You said we were a little behind the times here, which was disturbing.
Well, not necessarily behind the times. There's been tremendous research in terms of the effects of wake boats on lakes in
Right.
the last 10 or 15 years. But how did that come about? In the time before that, when they present themselves, people that live on lakes, they experience that. They see what's happening. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the boats on my lake, 800 feet from the shore, and I'm getting these big wakes. You clearly see what's happening. So people take that information, and that gets translated into the laboratory with very
Right,
sensitive material instruments for measuring disturbances at the bottom, for measuring wave height, wave power. And in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a tremendous surge, and most of the important studies in our petition are those from those last 10 or 15 years. So Pat, what I'm saying is, what's going to happen in the next
Right,
15 or
right.
20 years? There's going to be so much more that's going to come out that's going to verify what people on lakes have been observing already and what they know to be true. Right now they're being translated into these testimonials, but these are the reality of what we're having. And if we make a mistake, that is, if the DEC, and we can encourage the DEC to protect lakes for future generations, and we haven't even gone into this, but wake boats in the last 25 years, and we've looked at this, they've increased their power, their horsepower, they've increased their weight, not
Right.
their ballast weight, but their dry weight. It's about doubled in that period of time. So in the future, if you're going to pay attention to the
Right.
future, it seems to us that you need to be aware of that. And that's one of the things we're trying to draw people's attention to. And what I'm saying is that the science that's taking place right now that has not reached the textbooks, it's not reached
Right.
publication, that's going to be coming out. We do not want to make an error where we don't consider those things and we're worse off.
Do you know what I noticed when I was doing some research is that there have been studies all over the world pretty much. So this isn't a
This is not a Vermont problem.
issue.
No.
It sounds like it's, I know there was over in Europe, there's been some studies and
And
lots
many
of folks involved.
many government authorities throughout our country and other countries have already acted on this. Some of them have banned wake boats.
Right.
Many of them have restricted them to stay far from shore in the deep water. So we're not alone here in Vermont. I want to follow up on
Yes,
something
please, because you were
Jack
talking
said,
about some errors you thought
Yeah,
we've made.
that we didn't act prudently a few decades ago when we knew that agricultural runoff would foul our lakes and ponds.
Right.
And we see the results today. We see them in Missisquoi Bay. We see them on the shore in Georgia.
Very costly.
We see it in Lake Carmi.
Yeah.
These lakes are unusable. You can't fish in them. You can't swim in them. You can't enjoy the lakes anymore. Let's not do that. Let's not do that again.
Right. You also talked about about real estate and stuff,
Yeah.
and that's a big issue which I hadn't heard before, and
Yeah.
that's a little unnerving.
The town of Georgia, which has lots of taxable property right there
Right.
on Lake Champlain, well, the value of those camps and homes, when the lake got polluted, the value went way down.
Right.
The grand list of the town went way down. The other taxpayers had to pick it up. My friend Bob Martin, who's been a lister in the town of Woodbury, Woodbury has the record of having the most lakes and ponds of any other Vermont town.
I didn't
Bob
even
says
know that.
There's 26 of them. And his estimate, having been a lister, is that should wake boats spoil the Woodbury lakes like the algae spoiled the lakes around Lake Champlain, why the grand list would go down by 15%.
Wow.
And it'd be at least $100,000 of tax loss that would have to be picked up by the other taxpayers. Because wake boats would make the small lakes in Woodbury less attractive to the rest of us.
For sure. Right.
And to the tourists.
Less tourists, et cetera. Right. Great.
So what happens to the lakes is not just your property value going down, it affects the whole town, the whole tax base.
Right.
So it's not isolated to a few wealthy people who own lake property.
Taxes are an issue that's discussed a lot in Vermont, enough is enough. That's really amazing. I'm so glad you've all brought this up to get people informed about what's going on. I would like to see one of these wake boats. They sound lovely, though, I must say.
Well, we don't have one, so
We don't have. That's good. That wouldn't be good if you did.
Else.
Yeah.
We didn't bring one to the studio. But
Well, could you explain now, because we've got a couple of minutes, and I'd love to you introduce the video that would maybe talk a little bit about what we're talking about now.
yeah, if you want to see some wake boats, you'll see them in this next
Right.
video. The Willamette River in Oregon. Like our lakes, it's used for recreation. People paddle, they swim, they water ski. Wake boats arrived 5 or 10 years ago, and they completely ruined the recreational capability of a very popular 25-mile stretch of the river. And as a result of a study done by a scientist from Australia, which looked at the damages, the same kind of results, the same kind of graph we saw earlier, they in Oregon have banned wake boats completely from doing wake surfing in that stretch. And this video explains a little bit how that happened.
Wow, that's great. Is there anything else before we show the video that you'd like to wrap up the show with at all? Just anything?
Well, I like to maybe end where we started, Pat, is, responsible wakes for Vermont Lakes,
Right.
how we view ourselves. We're a citizen group. We're not even a nonprofit. We're just people that came together that saw a problem. Most of us live on lakes or in a watershed, so we saw this happen. And, when I think about Vermont, and I've been coming here my whole life, I think of the things that have been done for Vermont. For instance, the billboard
right.
laws, back in 1968. That's been 50 years. We had a Republican legislature at the time, and they decided they didn't want billboards, and they fought the industry for doing that. And I think a lot of people still come to Vermont because
they do.
because of not having
I
billboards
think
here.
Howard Dean was very involved in that. I worked for him, and it was the only letter I ever wrote to a governor to say thank you, because I had been on vacation, and all we saw for hours and hours were billboards, and I came back and I said, thank you very much. So we got that right.
But we see ourselves in that tradition, and
Yeah.
there are other things too.
That was a grassroots effort,
Yeah.
led by the people.
Right.
And if you remember Act 250, about 10 years later. But at the time, I mean, it's changed, but at the time.
Just a little.
At the time, it prevented uncontrolled development in Vermont.
Right.
Again,
And that was good. I agree with
That
you.
was the people
Yeah.
acting to make sure that this didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then, Jack, in the 1990s, people got together to control jet skis.
Yeah, I mean, the same sort of thing. They saw what was happening to their lakes, you know, the quiet,
Yeah.
peaceful
right.
environment, the noise that they had, and the personal danger that people were in with these jet skis, and they recognized this. And again, this was a grassroots
Nice.
movement. And, you know, we see ourselves in that tradition. We have no money. We just have our time. We see what's there, and to us, this is important
If
for
folks
Vermont.
listening want to jump on board and help you, how do they reach you?
They can go to our website, responsiblewakes.org,
Okay.
and we have a lot of the material that we talked about tonight, the videos, the
And there's a
graphs.
lot of people talking about their personal experiences, which I
Yes,
thought was very
testimonials.
interesting. Testimonials, right?
They can sign up to get our little newsletters that we're putting out every week or two.
Great.
Where we'll keep them informed.
Well, thank you both.
And if they want to support us, Pat, show up for that last hearing.
Yes, exactly. Well, we'll get that
Let their
word out.
voices be heard.
There you go. Thank you all for listening and tuning in. We really appreciate it, and I hope you learned a lot tonight. Thank you, gentlemen, for being on the show. This is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbite.
Things have changed since then. In particular, wake boats began to appear on the river about 15 years ago. The ones currently used on the Willamette can range up to 25 feet long, weigh over 12,000 pounds when fully loaded, and have motors that put out over 400 horsepower. These boats plow the river into massive artificial waves and are used for wake surfing, wakeboarding, and tubing. Across the country, complaints have arisen about the damage these boats cause to the environment and property, as well as spoiling the enjoyment of water bodies by other users. The Willamette River has been hit especially hard because of its relatively narrow width and limited ability to dissipate boat wakes.